o'clock. I think we're close enough to that. Let me go ahead and call this special meeting of the Board of Finance to order for Tuesday, June 16th, 2020. I think we have a fairly short agenda today, so we'll go ahead and get started. First item up for discussion is approval of the suspense minutes. Kathy,
So I know, Dan, this is new, and Taylor, this is new for you guys. But once a year, I come before you asking for the Board of Finance's approval to write off what is called our, to add certain uncollected receivables into the suspense account, which basically removes these taxes from the receivable. We deem them, I deem them as uncollectible. However, collection efforts do continue on them. And I gave you a spreadsheet which kind of gives you what the history has been on prior year suspense collections for like the last 8 years. What I'm asking to be suspended this year is $13,724.14. It represents 11 personal property accounts, 70 motor vehicle accounts, and 18 supplemental motor vehicle accounts for a total of 99 accounts. This is versus the original amount that was billed of over $6.8 million and just under 20,800 accounts. So I don't know if you haven't. There was nothing unusual. I looked through all the accounts. It's, nothing big, nothing unusual.
one thing to stress for Taylor and Dan, just so you know, that the suspension of these accounts is a balance sheet exercise. So in other words, they're pulled off the town balance sheet. The collection efforts don't actually end, right? So these individuals are still liable for these taxes or entities. It's just that they're no longer on the town's balance sheet as a
receivable,
collectible or receivable asset. Yeah. And maybe you could just follow up on some of the collection efforts you've had in the past on prior suspense lists and some of the successes for that, which I love to do every year because it's always a successful.
Yeah, I mean, I turn a lot of accounts over to a collection agency after about a year. So they're better able to find people that I can't find. So they help in some of these numbers. Also, we have them in our tax database. So if someone leaves the state of Connecticut and they come back, we have 15 years for unpaid motor vehicle that will stay on our system, and they won't be able to do anything at DMV until they pay the old taxes. So we have different ways that we can enforce year period.
If we know that names on this list are still residents, do you cross-check against other databases where the taxes might be getting paid on other assets, just not on this specific asset?
You can share with me at another time what you're looking at, but sometimes yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Happy to do that.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions for Kathy? This is terrific. Every year I appreciate your efforts on this. It's not just a great reflection on your department and all your colleagues, but a real benefit to taxpayers to really demonstrate that, look, we collect taxes from everybody who owes them, and we treat that seriously. So thank you again from all of us. Motion to approve the suspense list. Dan, second. Paul, all in favor? And we've got, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this, we have Frank, Rob, and Jim on the phone. Gentlemen, are you all there?
Yes.
Okay, terrific.
Yes, I'm in favor.
In favor, Rob and Frank?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Passes 7-0. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Jim says they're having trouble hearing us.
Yes, I just got that. So I don't know that there's anything that we can do. I think Kathy's the only person who's speaking up at the microphone today, so hopefully you can hear everybody else at the table, but we'll try to speak loudly and clearly. Okay, next up is transfers for the police clothing allowance, $9,450. Jennifer?
When the contract settled with the police department, the budget was already in place, and there were two significant changes with the contract. One is that they can take holiday time and not be paid for all of their holidays, which is resulting in a surplus in the holiday pay account. But their clothing maintenance allowance was increased, which is resulting in causing a deficit in that account. So what we are looking to do is transfer funds from the holiday account to the uniform, the clothing maintenance allowance to cover the expenses.
Okay, the clothing maintenance allowance is to purchase clothing, clean clothing?
This is to clean their,
Uniform?
their uniforms, yes.
Got it, okay. $500 per sworn
Per year.
officer?
Yep.
Okay, all right.
Which isn't a large amount, but up 67%.
Yeah, it was the result of negotiations. And I don't think it had been increased for quite some time.
Everybody on the phone hear that explanation? This is to cover a union contract negotiated amount to increase the clothing allowance for each uniform officer to $500 per year. Any of you folks have questions? Okay.
Not here.
Good deal. Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve this transfer? Paul, second. Taylor? All in favor? Okay, 4 here. Everybody on the phone okay with this?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Great, okay, 7-0, thank you. All right, next up is, we have discussed reserve account review. So I'd like Jim to talk a little bit about this, but just as a preview, in prior meetings, one of the things that I've spoken about is maybe the idea of accelerating the periodic review that we do of all the reserve accounts in town. There are quite a few of them, and as part of that process, what we typically do is look at the accounts, see what the activity has been, and talk to the department heads that are responsible for those accounts so they can give us a sense as to next steps, the appropriateness of the amount in the account, their plans for spending it, and any unusual things like a delay or some other type of problem. So we'd like to initiate that review this summer as opposed to in the fall when we typically do it. The budget process this year actually resulted in some changes to those accounts, which we did not initiate out of the Board of Finance. That was recommended by F&B, and some of those changes, all of them I think that they came up with, were adopted by the RTM. So one of the things we'll do as part of this process is take a look at the accounts that F&B actually adjusted as part of their changes in the RTM process, and we'll make sure that there wasn't something overlooked as part of that work, or if some of those accounts need to be restored in some way, since I don't believe the department heads or others that were responsible for all those accounts were fulsomely consulted as part of that decision-making process. So we're going to launch that this summer. I know, Jim, you've got a particular interest in that and might be leading the charge for that. Can you add to that perspective?
Yeah, John, what I discussed was I think what would be helpful, coming up on the next budget process would be to do a little bit more wholesome analysis of our unrestricted fund balance. And I think, there were a lot of questions over, like during this budget season, about what a reserve is, what our policy is, what guidelines the rating agencies have given us in terms of the amount that we hold and how that plays into our AAA rating. And while I still think our policy, which is, which we went over, I think 18 months ago or 24 months ago in the past, I think it's still, still the right policy. I think we could, I think it'd be helpful to kind of put together 4 or 5 pages of a more wholesome report, show what that historically, and show how that matches up with the rating agencies, so that, our various boards, the RTM and the constituents sort of understand why we're holding the amount that we hold and kind of how that plays into our budgeting. So, I think my focus on what would be most helpful is on the unrestricted fund balance. That said, all of these other reserve accounts that you're talking about, some of which the F&B recommended making changes to, I think we should obviously review them as well, because anything that sits in a restricted reserve account is not included in our unrestricted fund balance. And if it's not being used, it should be put back in there. We should be able to make the appropriate adjustment. So again, my focus is more on the aggregate unrestricted general fund balance.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We should have a good sense by the time of the July meeting how we've ended up for the current fiscal year. So we'll have a reasonably good view as to what dollar amount is sitting in fund balance, and we'll be able to talk about not just that aggregate dollar amount, but the dollar amount that's over and above our current 12% floor, 12% of budgeted revenues floor for fund balance, and then give the public just a general sense of how much that is and what's available to cover unforeseen expenses related to the pandemic or really any other purpose. As I've said before, the fund balance really is there for emergency expenditures. The fact that we have it is a measure of town financial health, and certainly the pandemic is reasonably an emergency, but I think we'll have a good balance in fund balance to help us if it appears that we're going to have a lot of expenses in that regard. And as I've also said in prior meetings, we just don't have a sense yet of what that is, right? I mean, schools will be starting up in the fall, but in terms of being more precise about exactly what that's going to entail in terms of investments in protective equipment or changes in facilities or scheduling of students or mixes between in-person and online education and what all that's going to cost, that nobody has a clue at this moment. That's part of the reason I thought it was important to keep fund balance set aside for now, so that when those expenses start to come into view, that we'll have those reserves to deal with them. So again, I think to Jim's point, if we can take a look at all these reserve accounts in addition to fund balance and make appropriate changes, we'll go into the fall with the most money in fund balance that we can reasonably have to meet these expenses.
And John, just to add, like, obviously in addition to unexpected expenses that might pop up, the other primary purpose that fund balance serves is to deal with sort of a shortfall in revenues, whether they be property tax revenues, whether they be grant income, whether they be building projects and so forth. And so I think we should, I think as part of that review, I think we can further detail why we're right now sitting around 15%, which is the very bottom of the range for the AA category, and kind of how that plays into our planning on a rating.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is launch that review process at our July meeting, and more to come on that, and we'll have a few more details and certainly some materials available to the public as we go through that process. And as always, we would invite comments as that effort unfolds over the summer. So any other questions or comments on that?
Well, two questions really. One is, so at the July meeting, we'll have a list of the, for lack of a better phrase, the restricted reserve accounts and what the activity's been, what the requirements are. Will we get that ahead of time? What's our process of getting that list?
Yeah, Jennifer might be able to speak more succinctly to that. As a general matter, what we'll do is simply start with a list of all those accounts and take a look at that.
Yeah.
Against each one of those, she's going to have a perspective as to where they sit in the pecking order, which I would define as, on the one end, funds that are actively being used, and there's a reasonable view that, look, they're going to spend them all for whatever project that fund is attached to older funds or funds that don't look like they're going to be spent for some reason that are candidates to move to fund balance. I don't know, Jennifer, you have anything to add to that, or is that?
That's most of it. When we talk about the reserve accounts, the vast majority of those reside in the reserve for capital non-recurring expenditures, so they're all capital related. But we do have several that were established many, many years ago, and it'll be worthwhile to say, is it still valid to have a reserve for that purpose? What is an appropriate balance, because the balances do roll over year to year, and just put some criteria around when we use reserves versus just funding from either the Board of Finance contingency and capital or from a special appropriation from fund balance.
Right. The other thing I'd like
Well, the equipment reserves that we talked about, a couple of sessions ago, the fire equipment and reserves and.
Yeah, those are the types of accounts that will be on here.
Yeah, it's because we were going to focus on those, I think, in particular.
Right.
Right, those are the largest reserves, and that'll all get caught up in this review that we'll do.
Okay, and are we going to invite F&B to this, or we want some input?
Oh, no, this process will be fully open and all public, and we will take input from all quarters, including, importantly, the Board of Selectmen.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay, super. Jennifer, financial report?
Fiscal 20 is unusual. The largest item we have, of course, is property taxes, and that is very good. We had our 2 major collection periods before COVID hit, so as of right now, tax collections are about 99.5% of the actual grand list that was levied with the corrections that have occurred throughout the year. But we are 100.2% of budget, which is always a good thing, but we build in that cushion. On the expenditure side, we definitely saw a dip during COVID, but now we are beginning to see some additional expenditures as we reopen. Particular area of concern is the beaches. They've had increased security. So you'll see a transfer coming to you at your next meeting because they've had to have additional security to manage capacity and entrance, that sort of thing. But those are going to be continuing to come to you. More than likely, they'll be able to find it within their department because they did not run programs. We'll probably transfer from programs over to security within the Parks and Rec department. But those are the kinds of things, additional staffing, outside services, that sort of thing as we start reopening. In terms of COVID, we are tracking our expenditures. We have many avenues for seeking reimbursement. The primary avenue is through FEMA. Their event period covers expenditures that are COVID related from basically late January, and it's expected to run through December. And they will reimburse 75% of eligible expenses. So far, we have submitted a FEMA claim of about $80,000, and we're waiting for their review and approval of that. Another avenue is federal funding for schools, which I believe the schools have already applied for, and we received notification, I think it was back in May, that they're going to be receiving about $130,000 in the next year for COVID-related expenses. And then we have received information from the state that they will be sharing their CARES Act funds with municipalities. They have provided, the intention is to make municipalities whole after they've exhausted all of the other federal avenues. So it can be used for the 25% match for FEMA. It can be used for items that were COVID related and acceptable under CARES, but were not eligible under FEMA. So the intention is to make everybody whole. Right now they have released an allocation. For us, it's just over $10,000. All of their allocations were based on preliminary information that each municipality sent, I think, the beginning of April. So pretty much everybody on the call was saying that their expenses are greater than what they had anticipated in April. And the state understands that they expect municipalities to come back and true up their numbers. But for now, it's a $10,000 allocation. And their intention is to have municipalities apply by the end of August for expenses from March 20th through June 30th. And then they'll have another round because they also intend to cover expenses through the end of December.
Okay.
So to date, we've spent on COVID between overtime and other expenditures, we've spent $118,000 actually out the door. And one big item in that is we had $45,000 of legal fees associated with COVID. So that's that has all been submitted to FEMA, so hopefully they will approve the 75% on that.
Are those legal expenditures planning related, or are they defense related? In other words, we're defending against something.
A lot of them were understanding executive orders and what our administrative process, how it needed to change to comply with the executive orders.
Okay. Questions on the financial?
Just one. Do you know what basis the state is using to allocate so far? Just because if we don't have the information, if they don't know what we're getting from FEMA, then how are they already kind of allocating us $10,000? Is it?
So what we submitted to them back in April was an estimate of $40,000. Kate put that together, and I think that there was some confusion amongst all the municipalities of, are you looking for the non-FEMA amount because we're expecting to get the 75%? So I think some people only did their expected 25%, others put in the 100%. But it looks like what the state mostly did was take the number that we submitted of 40,000 and say, okay, 25% of that, because the assumption is that we'd submit 40 to FEMA, get 75% covered, and the state would cover 25. But I think they're very aware that that's not going to work. And they've received about 70 million of CARES funds and allocated about 40 million through this initial allocation. So they definitely have more funds, and they, like I said, they've made it very clear the intention is to make all of the municipalities whole.
Great, thank you.
Looking ahead to fiscal '21, a couple of things on tax deferrals. The application deadline is July 1st. So far, we have 34 known applications. They're a mix of residential and commercial, and the property tax on those applications is about $325,000. So far, I think much less than the worst case scenario that we were taking into consideration. But like I said, they do have until July 1st. The tax collector has heard of a few others who have inquired, but they have not yet applied.
And so just as a reminder, the way the tax deferral works is that these are deferrals of amounts, deferral of payment of the amounts owed from July 1st to October 1st. So in other words, this is not about these amounts not being collected. It's just about them being collected in October as opposed to now.
Correct.
Right.
And the tax collector has heard from some of them that they're applying for the deferral. They plan to make kind of progress payments throughout that time, but they are applying for the deferral to give them the longer time to make their full payment.
What's the dollar mix between commercial and residential?
That I don't know. I just know it's about 325 total. And then the other item related to fiscal '21 that I wanted to talk about was with the RTM reductions. The capital items are kind of one area that the Board of Selectmen and Town Administrator will go back, look at, and figure out how or if they need to address those. But with the reduction in contingency of $100,000, the Town Administrator and I do have some concerns about that, given it's a year of unknowns. We know that if we have significant expenses related to reopenings and changes in the way we need to do things, you've made it very clear that we can come back for a special appropriation. But one area that we are concerned about is our legal fees. Our affordable housing moratorium is expiring, and that usually results in higher legal fees. And we also are expecting that, although through reval we didn't have that many challenges to property values, it is possible that when people receive their tax bill, they may appeal their assessments. So we do have some concern about that. What Kate and I are going to do is identify some kind of indicator accounts, keep a good eye on the legal accounts, but we're also going to identify those accounts, programs, or services that we might deem as less essential that could be paused or reduced mid-year if we find that expenses are running a lot more than expected, or if on the revenue side, the revenues just aren't coming in.
On the contingency, was it reduced by 100,000 or reduced to 100,000?
Reduced by 100,000.
Okay.
So it leaves a $300,000 contingency.
Okay. For the meeting in July, it would be interesting to get a more detailed sense of the affordable housing situation. So I don't know if there's somebody who could talk to that, or whether that could be something you could summarize, but it would be great to get a sense, not just exactly when that moratorium expires, but where we are in the scheme of things, right? So in order to apply for an extension of the moratorium, what's going to be required, and how far away are we from that, and who's kind of responsible for tracking all that, just so that we have a sense for how significant the challenge is to get to the next moratorium.
Okay, can do that.
Okay. Other questions on the financial report?
Ken, I got it. Thanks, Rob. Just a quick question. The special ed ECR, is that number at 2.5 million final for the year?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
One question I had with.
And Jen, it's Jim here. Has you taken out like us submitting our FEMA, our COVID-related expenses and so forth? the amounts that we submit, like, will that be including amounts that were like not reimbursed by the Board of Ed? I know that the money that the state, the 100 million-ish that the State Board of Education was handing out, I think was allocated via Title I, or not necessarily proportionally. So I guess I was curious, are we able to submit kind of town-wide COVID-related expenses?
Yes, Board of Ed expenses that have not been reimbursed through another avenue can be requested through FEMA if they're eligible, or through the State CARES Act if they've exhausted their other federal avenues. So Mark McEwen is our Emergency Management Director, and he's coordinating the FEMA application, and I believe he has reached out to the Board of Ed to see if they have anything to submit.
So is it one application that we as a town submit, or are there two different, does the Board of Ed submit their own application?
I believe it would be submitted as a town application, but unlike other FEMA events where, maybe it's a hurricane and you just had to do your cleanup, the expectation on this is that we will have ongoing applications. So we did one on May 22nd. As more expenditures occur, we'll do another application all the way through covering expenditures through the end of December. And Board of Ed can absolutely be included in those.
And will we include these in the financial reports going forward?
You mean in terms of disclosing them as specific COVID expenses, or just running them through our accounts?
Or just updating us on the status of all those different things. What do you think? What are you looking for, Frank?
Well, I just thought it would be useful to kind of put on a kind of a supplemental page for a few months.
Sure, I can do that.
What's been submitted, what's expected, that kind of thing.
Okay.
That's actually a really good idea. That's something we should keep track of. That's great.
I would almost think, John, Jen, if you could set it up where you have sort of a matrix of town and school related expenses that we're tracking, what's been submitted, and then what's actually been reimbursed. And to Frank's point, kind of let's track that throughout next year.
Terrific. Other questions on the financial report?
Just want to add, Jen, you mentioned that you're concerned with the legal fees in the wake of the items you talked about, and that as the year unfolds, you may be reducing spending elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just in the operating budget, or does that extend to the capital budget?
We're expecting the challenges to occur in the operating budget. So that would be the first place that we would go, but if we felt that there was nothing we could do in the operating budget to control it, we could put the brakes on a capital project that was approved in the reserve for capital non-recurring and reallocate through a transfer coming through you, rather than it being transferred over to capital to fund that project, funding an expense in the general fund.
Thank you.
Jen, when we reviewed the library budget, we were told there was a good sized surplus building for fiscal year 20, but now it looks like that's gone. Do we have any color on where it went?
Are you saying that it looks like it's gone because of what you're seeing in the financial report?
It says 100% used.
Right, because this is only reflective of the quarterly payments that we have sent out to them. We have fully sent their allocation over to
So
them.
if there's a surplus.
Right, so after the year end, if there's something
Yeah.
remaining and the agreement is for them to turn it back, we'll see that after they close their books.
And I noticed that this is as of May 31, so there's just 1 month left, right? So
Right.
I would expect that if things were coming in at a regular rate, we would be higher in the percent collected, like in the other revenues department, we'd be higher than 85%, we'd be at like 92. Is that normal? Is it just like a timing thing, or?
So in the other revenues are some items that are not regularly scheduled. We have some, aside from the major transfers in that you see as a standalone item, there's a few items that come in from the parking fund to the general fund, or the sewer fund to the general fund. Those total about $120,000. We book them at year end. There's a 1 month lag usually on interest income between what I'm able to report here by the time we get the statements. So it's not unusual, but I would not expect that we're gonna hit 100% of our other revenue budget. I think that is gonna be short.
And then I guess just finally, I noticed that the human services outside assistance budget, was over, and it was something that we were concerned about in the budget process. Is that, how are they doing? Do they need more money? We moved money.
On that account, what we did when the pandemic really started to impact us, we moved, I think it was about $30,000 from their essential needs account in the general fund to a bank account at TD Bank that Human Services Director has direct checking account access so that she could be responsive to residents that had needs. She has not touched any of that because donations have more than offset any need-related expenses that she's had. She's actually taken in just over $32,000 in donations and has $26,000 of expenses so far. So that money that went over to that bank account will come back to the general fund once we true up her donations. But in the next month, I don't imagine she's going to exceed what she has received as donations.
Great.
Other questions on the financial report? Okay, terrific. Minutes, so we've got 3 sets of minutes, budget related as far as I can tell. Dan, you've had a chance to go through all these, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments or questions on the minutes?
I had one change. Find the page. Oh, actually, 2 changes. Should I tell you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the
You got
May,
it.
I think it's the May 12th, looks like, May 12th meeting.
Okay.
Page 2 at the bottom, it was my quote. I spoke about, the last paragraph, I spoke about unanticipated expenses and said there could be much more expenses in the future, whether it's higher enrollment, not lower. And then the only other one was May 14th, page 4.
Did you get that, Jen?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I don't have mine.
May 14th, page 4, in the middle, it just says Mrs. McKinnon. It was, I think, Jill McCammon, and I was confused for a while, so I just didn't want anyone to be
Thank you.
confused later on.
Terrific. Yeah, and the only other edit I've got is, I appreciate the promotion, but on page 2 of the May 14th minutes, paragraph right there from the bottom says Dr. Zagrodsky. My brother's a doctor, but I don't think he's in the meeting, so I changed that back to mere Mr. So I didn't have any other edits. So I'm thinking that Dan actually just left that in there to bring mirth and merriment to our happy proceedings.
I
but-
struck chair.
Yeah.
Chairman Zagrodsky, fearless leader.
On page 3 of the minutes from the 14th, 3rd paragraph, Mrs. Hocking's name is misspelled. And then again in paragraph 7, it is misspelled again.
Thank you.
Okay.
I made a note to Jen. There are lots of misspellings when we get the transcripts.
Yeah.
I try to get to them all, but a lot of them are catchable upon an immediate kind of reread of a
Right.
transcript because they're proper names that are.
Right.
So I think, Jen, you were going to speak to the
Yes,
the
I have
service.
spoken, I've reached out to the head of the clerical service, and she is aware of it and will work on it.
Thank you.
And that's tough because they're no longer in the room, so there's a chance that they can't fully hear the conversation or
Fair enough.
whatever. So,
Yes.
okay. Well, anyway, I appreciate that service very much. It certainly saves us some time in preparing these minutes, so thank you for that. Okay, I believe all of us were present for all of these meetings. Can we just do a vote on all 3 at once as amended? Is that okay with you, Jennifer?
That's fine.
Okay. Motion to approve the minutes for May 7th, May 12th, and May 14th as amended. Taylor, and second, Dan. All in favor?
Aye.
Everybody?
I approve.
Yep, everybody on the phone? Okay, good. All right. Special assignments, committee reports. Anybody from the various committees, from audit to shared services to construction projects, Oxridge, anything?
I've got a quick update on Oxridge.
Okay,
So
Dan, please.
things remain on track. I mentioned at the last meeting that we'd moved to a alternate phasing from an enabling phasing. And basically, the cost estimate came in meaningfully higher than had originally been proposed by the design team. And so they went back to the drawing board to try to bring in a project that cost meaningfully less than that. And that iterative process is ongoing, but this new proposal seems to get to most of that. And it will enable Oxridge to remain, the kids to remain in school for the entire school year. But that's because it's going to take another 9 months to complete the project. And then when they do complete the project, it'll be opened in phases. So certain services won't be available in September 22 when the academic wing becomes available. Like the cafeteria won't yet be available and certain other things. So it'll be a little bit of a get used to process. But it is, again, it's addressing the cost increases that had crept into the proposal.
Okay. Have there been any discussions about design modification or even timeline modification as a result of the pandemic?
That was a neighbor's question, and the answer is no. There hasn't been. We're still moving paper around, pretty much, right? So there's really no shovels in ground for a while.
Okay.
So I don't think anything's been impacted by that, and all the professionals seem to be fully engaged.
Okay.
So they were originally going to knock part of the building down this summer, right? But now, what's the beginning of?
I'm not exactly sure when. Well, they're no longer going to knock part of the building down.
Right.
Until the new building, until the kids move into the new building. Okay.
Right.
So I'm not sure when that was supposed to be, but that is now not happening until I think the spring, the spring of 20. Well, it's not opening until the fall of 22.
Right. But so then the first real action with the shovel in the ground would be to start like the foundation of the new school, and that's
Right.
We don't know when, like this fall.
There's a date, I just don't have it at the top of my head. I don't think it's as early. It might. I don't think it's as early as this fall.
Terrific. Okay. Paul?
Oh, I just have some general comments because, just to correct some items. It has been misstated in the local press that I'm a retired school business manager from Ridgefield.
Okay.
I served there from November of 08 to December of 17. I'm currently employed in Plymouth and I'm a business manager. Also, in a previous meeting with Board of Education members, it was stated that Plymouth, where I work, a Durg F school, and East Haven, a Durg G school, have non-lapsing accounts. I'd like to correct that statement.
Okay.
Since Plymouth does not have a capital budget, any surplus is requested to be deposited into a sinking fund for capital improvements in accordance with Connecticut General Statutes 10-248A. East Haven does not have a non-lapsing account. In Durg A, in which Darien is a member, only Region 9 and Westport have non-lapsing accounts. Also, during this budget process, we heard the possibility of canceling strings, sports, intramurals, etc. In the end, none of these things came to pass. So I'd like to congratulate both boards on that. And then Terry Wood asked me to pass this on. The phrase, "we are all in this together," has been often heard these days. However, it doesn't appear to apply to state employees. Last week, Governor Lamont asked state employees to postpone their pending raise in light of COVID-19 and the cash flow problems in Hartford. they refused. All employees will receive a 3.5% general wage increase, which is the cost of living, and those not on the top step will get a 2% step raise for a total of 5.5% total. So once again, are we all in this together?
Okay, thank you. All right. Other comments or committee reports, assignment reports, anything? Okay, chairman's reports. I'll just make a couple of comments about the RTM meeting from last week. One of the things I appreciate about that process is that it's a big, loud, messy discussion with lots of participants. It's one of the beauties of the American system is that even in the middle of a pandemic, we find some way to get together electronically and have it out, right? So everybody gets to a microphone or gets on camera in some way and expresses their point of view and makes it loudly and makes it stick. And so I think everybody who participated in that, whether it was members of the RTM, others who joined that discussion, or frankly just other boards or town officials who contributed thoughts or ideas or decisions in the run-up to that process should be commended as being part of that. And that's a great thing about this town is that everybody comes to the table and participates. In terms of the outcome, there's just not much to disagree with. We've come together collectively as a town and we've actually arrived at a lower mill rate, which really has to be applauded, especially when you take into account the fact that we were able, in my judgment, to stick with what I had articulated before, which is that we don't want to damage town assets, town services, or our ability to provide education to our children as part of the process of trying to get to a lower budget. And I think most would agree that we accomplished that. And so, again, if you think about a messy process where maybe there were a lot of back and forth and maybe some sharp words, if you set that aside and actually focus on where we ended up, which was a lower mill rate and preservation of everything that makes this town great, it really is a win all around. It's a win not just for taxpayers, but for everybody who lives here and everybody who works here. And so I think all these boards should take a step back and reflect on that and consider kind of where we've ended up. And it's a great, I think, a compliment to not just the citizens of the town, but the folks who stepped up in these elected roles to try and make that happen. I did want to do one shout out to the Board of Education. I know that as part of the process, they were saddled with an additional cut from the Board of Finance beyond what we talked about, or what they talked about as part of our process. And they took that process seriously. If you, who's on the phone, if you could push mute, please. Thank you. They took that process seriously. They've had several meetings to discuss it. And if you actually look at where they ended up, there was more than $700,000 in operating expense cuts that they came up with after the Board of Finance made its decision, or was part of that process, that appeared to have in no way affected the student learning or content delivery experience. And I think that's actually just great, right? This is the type of efficiency that we really were looking for. We were looking for some changes, improvements, or other adjustments that you could make, and anything ranging from contracts to how business is done to try to get to lower expenditures for the taxpayer without impacting the student experience. And I have to commend the Board of Education and the administration for the work they did to get to that point. I think it's fantastic. In addition, they took some money out of their current surplus to buy some equipment, some textbooks, I believe iPads, Chromebooks, that sort of thing. And you know what? That's perfectly fine too. This whole effort has been about trying to reach compromise, to try and get people to the table to discuss these things, and to work out a solution that achieves that balance. No one board can come up with a solution that's perfect. Where we got to, I think, was the result of collective effort, starting with the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education, the Board of Finance process that followed, the Board of Education's response to the decisions made by the Board of Finance, and then finally the RTM's appropriation itself. I think all of those entities came together and got us to a good spot. My final comment on that is that our work is not done, right? As we've all acknowledged publicly, there is the specter of expenditures that we're going to have to meet as part of preparations in the fall to open up schools but also frankly get the town back to sort of a more normal footing. We just don't know what that's going to be like. This pandemic feels like it's been going on for a lifetime. It certainly does to me. But the reality is we're only about 90 days into this, and the next 90 days could change a lot. So we don't know what that is. But I would just urge everybody who's listening to this to say let's adopt the same spirit that we had as part of this budget process, going into these additional discussions about what to do to respond to and take action to get back to normal as part of this pandemic. We're going to need to do it again. I hope it's going to be just as messy, right? Certainly I am prepared to take maximum criticism from all quarters, and I will encourage that. But at the same time, I still think with all of that messiness that we're going to get to a good answer for the town and for the citizens who live here and the employees who work here. So again, I appreciate everybody's work in this process. More to do and more to come, but let's stick with it. Let's keep it messy, and let's get to good decisions as we've done to this point. That is about all I had to say, except for one other thing I did want to include in terms of our July effort, and this will require some coordination with the Board of Selectmen and with our First Selectman. But the First Selectman and I have talked about, in addition to doing the review of these reserve accounts, that we take a look at our grant review process. This really is the purview of the Board of Selectmen, but I know Jamie has talked about the need to update, if you will, the process by which grants are provided to various town departments. So the library gets a grant, for example. The fire departments get a grant. The Historical Society gets a small grant. There are a few grants kind of here and there, but I think Jamie has expressed an interest in maybe sharpening all that up a bit. And you know what, I think that's a great idea. So what I'll commit to after this meeting is to reach out to Jamie, reconfirm our interest in trying to be supportive to her, the Board of Selectmen, in that process. And let's see if this summer we can launch something like that in parallel with the reserve account review, and come out of the summer with an updated set of perspectives in both of those areas. So I will undertake that after this meeting, and we'll add it to the July agenda.
Can I
Dan, go ahead.
suggest we add the fire apparatus accounting to that exercise?
Yes, those guys have both reserve accounts and grants, so they will be absolutely taken up as part of both
Great.
those processes, absolutely.
Grants, are you talking about state and federal grants, or grants
No.
just from Darien?
Great point. So what we're talking about are grants by the town to various departments, right? And this really is just on the town side, not on the Board of Education side. But we'll be taking a look at all of the town grant recipients as part of this process, and use that review to come up with a revised and updated policy perspective. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Anybody on the phone have anything to add? Okay, I think we are done. May I have a motion to adjourn? Dan, second. Paul? All in favor? Okay, 5:46 p.m. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.